Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? It helps us make quality content for you. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. The Zalari vessel descended through Earth's atmosphere in a controlled arc, its sleek, silvery hull gleaming against the morning sky. It was a diplomatic ship, unarmed, its sole purpose to make peaceful contact with the people of this world. Ambassador Tal stood at the observation deck, hands clasped behind his back, gazing at the planet that had perplexed Zalari scholars for decades. Humanity, by all observable metrics, was an anomaly. Their literature spoke of war, yet they had no off-world conquests. Their history was steeped in conflict, yet their governing bodies promoted peace treaties and cooperation. Their technology showed immense destructive potential, yet they had no significant military footprint beyond their own atmosphere. It was baffling. After much debate, the Zalari Dominion had reached a consensus. Humanity was a truly pacifist species, one that had grown beyond the need for warfare. Tal's mission was to extend an offer, one of guidance, protection, and integration into the Dominion's peaceful coalition. The craft touched down on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., its landing thrusters displacing dust and loose gravel. Waiting for the delegation was a gathering of world leaders, their formal attire crisp, expressions carefully neutral. Among them stood a man who did not fit the mold of a politician. Tall, broad-shouldered, his posture more disciplined, his eyes scanning the Zalari with analytical precision. Captain Ethan Reynolds had been selected as part of the U.S. delegation not for his rank, but for his understanding of both diplomacy and warfare. Tal descended first, his long robes flowing behind him. His dark, reflective eyes swept across the gathered humans before he offered a respectful incline of his head. On behalf of the Zalari Dominion, I extend my greetings to the leaders of Earth. It is an honor to meet a species so committed to peace. A murmur ran through the crowd, subtle but present. Reynolds caught the glance exchanged between General Marcus Holt and Secretary of Defense Wallace, a glance that spoke volumes. Tal had misread the room and the military officials knew it. The meeting was held at the United Nations headquarters, a grand yet aging structure filled with diplomats who spoke in measured tones and careful phrasing. Tal listened attentively as world leaders expressed their cautious optimism about the Dominion's offer. The Zalari, he explained, were a vast interstellar coalition dedicated to ensuring the survival of non-aggressive civilizations. In their history, war had been rendered obsolete through structured alliances and resource sharing. Their military, such as it was, existed only to mediate disputes between less evolved societies. We have studied your people, Tal continued, his voice calm and deliberate. We understand that you have known war, but we believe you have outgrown it. Your treaties, your international accords, your aversion to planetary expansion, all point to a civilization that has matured beyond the need for violence. The Zalari Dominion wishes to extend its protection to you, to shield you from the dangers of the wider galaxy. There was a long pause. Captain Reynolds kept his face carefully neutral, but General Holt did not share the same restraint. He let out a quiet breath, more amused than offended. Protection, Holt repeated as though testing the word. And what exactly do you think we need protection from? Tal blinked, a Zalari gesture of mild confusion. There are species less principled than ours. Raiders, warlords, opportunists who might see your world as an easy target. Easy target, Holt echoed, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of restrained laughter. You really believe that, don't you? Tal hesitated. There was something in the general's tone that unsettled him. Reynolds finally spoke, his voice even but laced with curiosity. Ambassador, your people have studied us for how long? Nearly a century, Tal replied. And in that time you came to the conclusion that humanity is, what? A society that abandoned war? A species that lacks military strength? We have seen your historical records, Tal said, his voice steady. Your most destructive conflicts are in the past. Your current military expenditure is negligible compared to the great powers of the galaxy. Your culture promotes diplomacy over conquest. Reynolds glanced at Holt, then back at the Zalari ambassador. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Ambassador, would you care to join us for a more detailed briefing at the Pentagon? Tal accepted without hesitation. The Pentagon was a fortress of information, a sprawling complex dedicated to military strategy, intelligence, and defense. As Tal and his delegation entered one of its high-security briefing rooms, they were met with a display screen spanning the far wall. General Holt gestured toward the image that had been carefully prepared for their guests. A chart, simple yet damning. This, Holt said, is the annual military budget of the United States of America. The number was staggering. Even by Zalari standards, it was excessive, an absurd figure that dwarfed the defense budgets of multiple planetary coalitions combined. Tal stared at it, his composure faltering for the first time since his arrival. "You must be mistaken," he said slowly. This is not possible. No peaceful civilization would allocate such resources to warfare." "Oh, we're peaceful," Reynolds said. "Until we're not." Another display flickered to life, showing high-definition satellite footage of coordinated military exercises, stealth bombers maneuvering with pinpoint precision, carrier strike groups deploying waves of aircraft, ground forces conducting urban warfare simulations with ruthless efficiency. Tal's breath came shorter now. The Zalari had military forces, of course, but they were largely ceremonial, designed to enforce treaties rather than wage war. The scale of Earth's preparations was something else entirely. Reynolds leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. "You see, Ambassador, your people made a mistake. You assumed that because we haven't expanded beyond our world, we aren't capable of doing so. That because we promote peace, we aren't prepared for war. What you failed to understand is that humanity isn't pacifist. We are pragmatic. We don't fight unless we have to, but when we do, we don't lose." Tal opened his mouth, closed it, then turned to one of his aides. They exchanged hurried words in their native tongue before he faced the humans again. This changes things. We did not anticipate." "No," Holt said, a rare grin breaking through his stern exterior. "You didn't." For the first time in the entire meeting, Tal looked truly uncertain. The Zalari had not come to dictate terms. They had come to extend what they believed to be a generous offer. And now, as reality settled over them like a crushing weight, they realized they had miscalculated. Holt leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Now, Ambassador, let's talk about what you can offer us." Silence hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications. Tal's fingers tightened into a slow, deliberate clasp. The Zalari had come expecting to guide a fragile world. Instead, they had uncovered something far more dangerous. And for the first time in centuries, the Dominion was afraid. Tal sat stiffly in the Pentagon briefing room, his composure visibly strained. The display before him still showed the figures that had shattered his assumptions. The sheer magnitude of Earth's military budget, a number so vast it eclipsed entire planetary coalitions. He had been prepared for many scenarios when approaching humanity. This was not one of them. Across from him, General Marcus Holt exuded the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable, yet there was a glint in his eye that suggested he was enjoying this moment more than he should. Captain Ethan Reynolds sat to Holt's right, watching Tal with the calm patience of someone waiting for an opponent to process an unpleasant truth. "We need clarification," Tal said at last, his voice carefully measured. "Your world is not engaged in an interstellar war. You do not have external enemies. What justification do you have for sustaining a military force of this magnitude?" Holt exhaled through his nose, amused. "Justification? Ambassador, we don't justify our strength. We maintain it." He tapped the screen, changing the display to a series of video feeds, high-altitude drone strikes, armored divisions advancing with seamless coordination, submarines moving unseen beneath the ocean's surface. "What you're looking at isn't the product of war. It's the product of preparation. You assumed we were weak because we haven't expanded beyond our own system. That was your mistake." Tal kept his hands folded, but his posture betrayed his unease. "It is highly unusual for a species to invest in such excessive military capabilities without an external threat. Surely, those resources could be redirected toward scientific advancement, infrastructure, medical expansion." "And yet here we are, Ambassador," Reynolds interrupted. His voice was polite, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Standing on a planet that hasn't been conquered, hasn't been annexed, hasn't been forced under anyone else's rule. You might want to ask yourself why that is." The doors slid open before Tal could respond, and a new presence filled the room. Taller than the other Zalari, with a hardened stance and a uniform distinct from the flowing diplomatic robes of his counterpart, Commander Valric entered without pretense of decorum. His movements were sharp, efficient, as if he had no patience for the proceedings. He surveyed the room with a tactical gaze, lingering on the holo display before settling his piercing gaze on Tal. "You miscalculated," Valric said bluntly, his voice carrying a clipped authority that demanded attention. He barely acknowledged the humans before addressing his own people. "You assured the Dominion that this species was harmless. That they lacked the means to defend themselves against greater galactic forces." He gestured toward the screen, his expression unreadable. "Did you even look at this before you opened negotiations?" Tullus' mandibles twitched slightly, the closest thing to a flinch his species displayed. "Our assessments were based on available data. Your assessments were wrong." Valrak turned toward the humans, studying them with open scrutiny. "You let us believe you were pacifists." Reynolds smiled slightly. "We never said we were pacifists. You just assumed." Valrak didn't seem pleased by the response, but he did not argue the point. Instead, he turned his attention to the numbers again. He wasn't like Tal. He wasn't a diplomat trying to make sense of an inconvenient reality. He was a strategist calculating odds, risks, and worst-case scenarios. And from the way his posture stiffened, he didn't like the conclusions he was reaching. "This is more than planetary defense," Valrak said after a long pause. "These capabilities are offensive. Your species has the means to wage war on a scale we did not anticipate." Holt leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together. "That's an interesting word choice. Anticipate, it suggests you were considering it as a possibility." Valrak met his gaze without hesitation. "We would be negligent not to. The Dominion does not bring new species into its fold without understanding the risks they pose." Tal looked as though he wanted to intervene, to smooth over the sharp edges Valrak had just carved into the discussion, but the commander continued. "You may not have warships, but you have strategy. You may not have conquered planets, but you have deterrence. And worst of all, you have discipline." He glanced back at the footage of human military drills, his expression unreadable. "Most species that reach your level of technology either expand recklessly or collapse under their own instability. You've done neither. That makes you dangerous in ways the Dominion did not account for." Holt's expression remained neutral. "Dangerous is a matter of perspective, Commander. You see a threat. We see a safeguard." "A safeguard against what?" "Whatever the hell comes knocking." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. The Zalari had walked into this room believing they were the dominant force, the wise shepherds guiding a fragile species into the larger galactic order. But now the roles had shifted, and they were beginning to realize the weight of their misjudgment. Tal cleared his throat, trying to recover. "The Dominion does not seek conflict. We came here in the spirit of cooperation. And now you're wondering if you should have brought a bigger fleet," Reynolds said dryly. Valrak did not confirm or deny it, but his silence spoke volumes. He was no longer looking at a primitive species in need of protection. He was looking at a potential rival. Holt studied the Zalari commander with the same quiet calculation. "So what happens now?" Tal straightened, regaining some of his diplomatic composure. "Now we re-evaluate our approach. It is clear that humanity is not what we believed it to be. That does not mean our goals have changed. We still wish to extend an alliance, though, I suspect, under different terms than originally intended." Holt nodded, unsurprised. "That's a start." Valrak's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. He had no doubt that the Dominion would proceed cautiously from here on out. The humans had revealed enough to command respect, but not enough to be fully understood. And that made them an even greater variable than before. As the Zalari delegation exited the briefing room, Valrak lingered for a moment, glancing once more at the display of military assets. His voice was quieter when he finally spoke. "You don't have a fleet," he said almost to himself. "But if you ever build one, the galaxy will have a problem." Reynolds only smiled. "Guess we'll see, won't we?" Valrak left without another word. Holt exhaled, shaking his head. "Well, that was fun." Reynolds chuckled. "They came expecting to put us under their wing. Now they're wondering if they should be worried." Holt gave one last glance toward the door where the Zalari had exited. They should be. Neither of them said it, but they both knew the truth. The Zalari had come as protectors. Now they were leaving as something else. Observers. And possibly one day competitors. The Zalari delegation departed Earth 3 days later. The diplomatic courtesies had been maintained, the formalities observed, and the official statements exchanged. Both sides had spoken of cooperation, of peaceful relations, of mutual understanding. But beneath the polished words an unspoken truth lingered. The Zalari had come expecting a lesser species. They had left knowing they had encountered something else entirely. Captain Ethan Reynolds stood on the Pentagon's rooftop helipad watching the sky. The diplomatic shuttle was long gone, vanishing into the upper atmosphere before making the jump to deep space. Yet even now he had the distinct impression that the Zalari were still watching. General Holt joined him, hands in his pockets, his gaze similarly locked on the sky. "Think they'll be back?" Reynolds smirked. "Oh, they'll be back. Just a matter of when and how." Holt exhaled sharply. That's what I was afraid of. There was no immediate threat, not yet. But the reality of what had just happened was setting in. The Zalari hadn't arrived with warships, hadn't issued ultimatums, hadn't displayed aggression in any form. They had come expecting to extend their protection to a weaker species. Now they had left with the knowledge that humanity was anything but weak. And that knowledge would ripple through the Dominion. The next few weeks passed in quiet tension. No official statements were made by the Zalari. No new envoys arrived. Intelligence agencies monitored the situation with laser focus, scanning for any sign of increased military presence near the Sol system. But for all outward appearances, the Zalari were simply silent, which was almost worse than immediate action. Reynolds found himself back at the Pentagon, this time in a classified briefing room, seated alongside some of the highest-ranking officials in the Department of Defense. Holt was there, of course, along with Secretary Wallace and several intelligence analysts. A massive display screen dominated the room, showing long-range scans of the Zalari fleet's known movements. Still no indication of hostilities, one of the analysts reported. But we've intercepted encrypted transmissions moving through Dominion space at a higher frequency than normal. Whatever they're discussing, it's happening at a classified level. Figures, Holt muttered. They don't know what to do with us. Reynolds leaned back, arms crossed. Or they do know. They're just taking their time deciding on the best approach. Wallace steepled his fingers. We need to be prepared for any scenario. Let's assume, for a moment, that the Dominion decides humanity is too unpredictable to integrate into their structure. What happens next? One of the intelligence officers, a quiet but sharp-eyed man named Lieutenant Carter, cleared his throat. Worst-case scenario? They start treating us as a potential problem instead of a potential ally. That doesn't mean war, at least not immediately, but it could mean containment, economic isolation, influence campaigns to turn other species against us, maybe even proxy conflicts. Containment, Holt repeated, tasting the word like it was something bitter. Hell of a thought. Reynolds studied the map. The Dominion's influence stretched across dozens of star systems, a sprawling coalition of worlds operating under what they called peaceful governance. The Zalari had managed to maintain galactic stability not through conquest, but through control, subtle, bureaucratic, enforced through politics rather than firepower. If they decided to cut Earth off, to limit its access to trade, technology, and interstellar partnerships. Could be worse, Reynolds said. They could decide to wipe us out before we get too advanced. The room went silent. It wasn't an exaggeration. If the Dominion determined that humanity's military potential was a long-term threat, they had the resources to act preemptively. A first-strike scenario wasn't likely, yet, but the possibility couldn't be ignored. Wallace exhaled slowly. So, options. Holt cracked his knuckles. We double down. We accelerate R&D, push space-based defense projects into overdrive. If they think we're a problem now, let's make it a problem. Reynolds smirked. You want to scare them more? They're already scared, Holt countered. Right now they don't know if we're a sleeping giant or a loaded gun. We lean into that uncertainty, they'll think twice before trying to box us in. Carter frowned. Or they decide we are a threat and escalate first. Silence settled again. There was no easy answer, no perfect strategy. Every path forward had risks. Wallace finally spoke. We need intelligence. Real intelligence. We need to know how the Dominion makes its decisions. Who calls the shots? What internal factions exist? If there are species within the coalition that might see us as an opportunity rather than a threat. Reynolds arched an eyebrow. You're talking infiltration. Wallace nodded. Something like that. If the Dominion sees us as a wild card, let's be a wild card. We find weak points, leverage them. Shift the game before they can define the rules. Holt gave a short laugh. We're about to piss off an interstellar government. We're about to make sure they never think of us as an easy target again, Wallace corrected. There were no further objections. The decision had been made. The next phase had begun. The Dominion had decided. Humanity was a problem. Tal received the directive in silence, standing motionless before the transmission panel aboard the Zalari command ship. The order was not for war, at least not yet. The Dominion would not risk open conflict with an unpredictable species, not when their true capabilities remained unknown. Instead, containment had been decreed. Earth would be isolated. Trade restrictions. Technological embargoes. Diplomatic pressure on lesser species to avoid human contact. It was the Dominion's tried-and-true method for ensuring control. It had worked before. But Tal had the gnawing sense that this time would be different. Commander Valric entered without ceremony, his steps measured, his posture sharp as ever. He had been waiting for this moment. Tal knew it, could see it in the way Valric's mandibles twitched slightly in grim amusement. They didn't take long, Valric noted, glancing at the message. Tal exhaled through his spiracles. No, they did not. Containment, Valric said, the word thick with skepticism. They believe that will be enough? They believe it will slow them down. Perhaps even deter them from further expansion. Valric let out a dry, humorless sound. Then they have not been paying attention. Tal had seen it too. The humans had played the role of an isolated species for a long time, but now that the galactic stage had acknowledged them, they would not sit idle. They would adapt. They would push back. And worst of all, they would learn. Valric studied Tal for a moment before speaking again. Do you agree with the directive? Tal hesitated. He was Zalari. He was loyal to the Dominion. But something about the order felt short-sighted. The humans had not threatened them. They had merely revealed themselves to be more than expected. And now, instead of reassessing, the Dominion sought to control them in the only way it knew how. It does not matter if I agree, Tal said at last. The decision has been made. Valric's mandibles twitched again. That is not what I asked. Tal turned away from the panel, fixing his gaze on the vast stretch of space beyond the viewport. The stars were quiet, but he knew that somewhere in the cold depths of the void, the humans were already making their next move. I think, Tal admitted, that we have underestimated them again. Valric did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to the same stars, as if searching for an answer that neither of them wanted to find. On Earth, the response to the Dominion's decision was swift. The embargoes were expected. The diplomatic cold shoulder was anticipated. The restrictions on trade and technology, predictable. None of it had come as a surprise to the people sitting in the Pentagon's classified war room. What had surprised them was how quickly humanity had decided to ignore it. General Holt stood at the center of the room, surrounded by the best and brightest minds in military strategy, intelligence, and covert operations. The massive screen displayed intercepted Dominion communications, trade routes, and classified human projects already in motion. Let me make this clear, Holt said, his voice calm but firm. We are not going to sit here and let them box us in. They think they can slow us down? Fine. Let's see how they feel when we start rewriting the rules. Captain Ethan Reynolds smirked from where he leaned against the table. I assume you've got something specific in mind, sir? Holt gestured at the screen. They control trade routes, but they don't control everything. There are independent traders, black markets, back-channel deals. We start making friends in places the Dominion isn't watching. One of the intelligence officers frowned. That's risky. If they catch us violating embargoes. They won't, Reynolds interjected smoothly. Because we won't be the ones doing it. Unaffiliated groups will. Holt nodded. Exactly. We don't need to break the Dominion's control directly. We just need to make their control irrelevant. Wallace, standing near the back, gave a rare approving nod. And while we're at it, we ramp up our own technological development. If they think we're a problem now, they haven't seen anything yet. The room hummed with energy. Plans were already forming. Networks being built. There was no hesitation, no fear, only purpose. Reynolds met Holt's gaze. And if the Dominion decides to escalate? Holt's smile was grim. Then we'll be ready. The first cracks in the Dominion's plan appeared within weeks. Reports trickled in. Unregistered ships slipping through embargoed zones. Human technology, modified, upgraded, appearing in places it shouldn't. Mercenaries and rogue traders finding ways to do business with Earth's scientists and engineers. The Dominion tightened its grip. But the harder it squeezed, the more humanity adapted. And then the first real shock came. A Zalari patrol intercepted an unmarked freighter near the outer edges of Dominion space. Routine inspection. Simple. But what they found inside was anything but simple. Human weaponry. New designs. Advanced. Compact. Efficient. And more importantly, something not of human origin but clearly modified by human hands. The patrol's commander, an experienced officer named Vashtel, stared at the crate before him, his tendrils twitching with unease. Where did this come from? The freighter's captain, a grizzled human with a scar running down his cheek, simply smiled. Wouldn't you like to know? The weapons were confiscated. The freighter impounded. The captain detained. But the damage was already done. The Dominion had tried to isolate humanity. Instead, they had forced them to innovate, to reach out to the very groups the Dominion feared the most. It was no longer a question of if humanity would become a major player. It was a question of how soon. On the Zalari command ship, Tal read the latest intelligence report with a sinking feeling. The containment strategy was failing. The humans were slipping through the cracks, adapting, evolving. And now they were arming themselves in ways no one had predicted. Commander Valric entered, his expression unreadable. He had seen the report too. "They've made their choice," Valric said simply. Tal nodded. "Yes, and so have we." Valric studied him for a moment. "Do you still believe containment will work?" Tal closed the report and looked up. His answer was quiet but firm. "No." Valric exhaled, his posture shifting slightly, as if some unspoken tension had just been confirmed. "Then we have one last decision to make." Tal nodded. "Do we fight them now?" A heavy silence settled between them. Then Valric shook his head. "Not yet." Tal frowned. "Then what?" "We watch," Valric interrupted. "We let them think they are winning. We let them push forward. We see what they become. And if what they become is something the Dominion cannot control?" Valric's eyes darkened. "Then we will have no choice but to destroy them." Tal turned back toward the viewport, watching the distant stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was already moving forward. Subscribing to our channel? And the next time the Zalari helps us make quality content, it would not be as diplomatic. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.